Hey, everybody, it's Bill Woodcock,
And Steve Hunt. Hello, hello, hello.
and you got a face full of Bill. As I announce, welcome to another wonderful episode of Forward Maryland. Fortunately, if you're listening to this podcast, you did not get a big face full of Bill, and aren't you lucky? Before we start with today's entertainment, Steve, I want to mention that the first But before we go, companion called the Gen X Experience Technology. Last week's episode was based on a chapter of that book. It's now available. Just put a mention in the comments if you want one. If you're following on YouTube, for me to get you a book, or go to Amazon and get your own copy, or you can also get a Kindle version there too. Steve, we have a very interesting episode today. Uh, Several weeks ago, the world lost a Gen X icon, and not always an icon for great reasons. O.J. Simpson died,
Yep.
and so I want to stay away from how I feel about O.J. Simpson today. I want to talk about how he was relevant from the 1970s to the 2000s or to 2000. I had an opinion in 1995 too, which I still hold today, which is that he's a non-convicted double murderer. But of course, the courts found him not guilty. He was found later to be civilly liable, but that was the most notorious thing he did, but that was not the only thing he did. And so I first remember O.J. Simpson as being the star running back from the Buffalo Bills. I remember going to a Sunoco station near my house and getting a directory, like a book. It was a book,
hmm
and they were called NFL Action Stickers. And they were like football cards, except they were stickers. They were stamps that you moistened and you turned to each team's page and you would fill in as you kept coming back to Sunoco. You would buy these books of these stamps and you would fill in the spaces of the players that you had. And I remember having an O.J. Simpson sticker, stamp, which I thought was very cool because at the time he had just become the first NFL running back to run for more than 2,000 yards in a season. And at that time, a season was only 14 games, not 17 like it is now. And then he went on to have a very productive career as an NFL player. And then it wasn't until later that I had learned that he had indeed been the Heisman Trophy winner, and I guess the late 60s sometime,
Yeah,
60
68. Yeah.
from University of Southern California. So what do you remember about him as a football player?
Well, you're right, Bill. I saw some of his highlights later from USC, and there's an iconic run of him against UCLA, which many say was the game that clinched the Heisman for USC in 1960. I mean, clinched the Heisman for Simpson at USC in 1968. And what I remember about OJ Simpson as a young black kid, especially one who was into sports, um, in the early to mid 70s, there were three people you watched. There were three people you followed. There were three people, quite frankly, you idolized: Muhammad Ali, Hank Aaron, OJ Simpson. That was it. I mean, there were other people out there, other great stars of sport and things of that nature, but those were the big three. There, you could pick any name, I'm sure, and say, "Oh yeah, well, I know that person too." But culturally and athletically, that was it. My first year playing, youth football, I was the running back on the team, and I was so bummed because back then, it wasn't like travel ball now where you could like ask for your number, whatever. You got whatever number was available. I was number 20 because there was no 32. And I tried every which way, asked the coach, maybe you could have a make one, maybe I'll wear it for the other half. She's like, that's not how we do it. I wanted 32 because I wanted to be OJ Simpson. And if you ever watched him run, there are some running backs that just look good running the football. And OJ was one of them. And it really became almost a debate between generations because if you were at the barbecue, you were at the cookout, the older folks would say, y'all don't know nothing about nothing. You ain't seen Jim Brown. So it was always the debate, Jim Brown versus OJ Simpson. And for many years, those two guys didn't like each other because they were in the middle of that debate of who was the greatest at the time. As an adult, I came to realize the correct answer really is Jim Brown. But as a kid, no, it was OJ. You couldn't tell me nothing about OJ. He was that dude. And then just the way he carried himself in interviews, he had this kind of, it was almost that 70s post civil rights era swagger about him, this confidence. He was not, say he was of the Ali generation. He would express himself much more than say a Jackie Robinson or Willie Mays and the guys from the 50s, 60s. So there was a flamboyance about him. There was he was Ali on the football field. So for me and friends of mine, when we played football, if you were the running back, you pretended to be OJ Simpson. Period. Hard stop. He was that dude, and he was that big.
So you bring up a very interesting point about his celebrity presence because yeah, he was Ali, but he was Ali without the swagger, without, and I don't
Well,
mean I
he had
shouldn't
his
say
own. He had his
swagger,
own.
the
He had his own.
braggadocio,
Yeah. Yeah.
braggadocio.
Yes.
He wasn't,
He had
you
style.
know, he wasn't, calling out, Deacon Jones and the rest of the fearsome foursome to come put his ass down,
Yes.
or Alan Page and the Purple People Eaters,
Right.
or, those great defenses of that time. You
True.
know, he had some humility in his public statement, but he also had a lot of confidence,
Yes.
and rightfully so. I would compare him to being a cross between in his playing style to Jim Brown, who came before him, and Barry Sanders, who came after him. And you mentioning number 20 made me think of this analogy
Yeah.
because he certainly was a powerful runner,
Mm-hmm.
like a Jim Brown, although I would agree, not as powerful, but
Yeah.
yet he also had the fluidity and the elusiveness of a Barry Sanders.
Yes.
And so he was extraordinarily well suited to go from Southern California to Buffalo, to outdoors football in Buffalo, and play in those conditions 7 times a year,
Yeah.
and do very well for the Bills. It is unfortunate that the Bills were never a more successful team then. They had deficiencies in other ways.
Sure.
Um, but he was by and large the superstar of the NFL. He played almost his entire career in Buffalo. And of course, we're talking about a time before free agency. So by the time he left there, and I want to say he went to one of the California teams
San,
to finish
San
his
Francisco.
career. I
Yeah.
thought he went to the 49ers,
49ers. But
but he was
he was from Oakland, so I think when the
right.
Bills decided to do a rebuild and trade him, he requested and they granted his request to go to San Francisco because he wanted to end his career near home.
And he was pretty much spent then. I mean,
Oh yeah.
he was a three down back. There were no running backs by committee. He would carry the ball 40 times a game, and the game, took a physical toll.
Yeah, it really did. And it's funny, you talked about the first person to run for 2,000 yards. He did that, I believe it was still a 12-game season in 73. I don't think they went to 14 yet. I'm trying to
Yeah,
remember.
I thought it was 14. We have
Might
to
be
go
14.
to go to the research
Yeah.
department.
But
What do you say?
we talked about in our previous episode
He
how
might
you
have
walk.
only played 12 games. He might have been hurt
Yeah.
for 2 games. I don't know.
But we talked in our previous episode about how you watch television, and usually you got your local game, and every once in a while the network would show a national game of some importance, during the regular season. And I remember watching that game, Shea Stadium against the Jets, and everybody in the building knew he was getting the ball because when the game started, he had not broken Jim Brown's record yet. So, and I forget how much he needed, but he ran for like 273 yards in that final game to get 2,000. So everybody knew he was getting the ball. Joe Ferguson, the Bills quarterback, later would say, "Yeah, I my arm got a break that day because I was not throwing squat." And he still ran again for like 273 yards to go over 2,000 by like I think 3 yards. I think it was like 2,003.
It was.
And I remember watching that game because they showed that game because really at the time it was about he's going to break Jimmy Brown's record. Nobody knew he was going to like go all the way to 2,000, and that's how big he was. Was he his that game between two teams? Maybe the Jets were going to go to the playoffs. I can't remember. The Bills weren't going anywhere, but they showed that game nationally because of the history that was going to be made by this running back from Buffalo. That's how big he was, and that's how big that event was in 1973. And I remember watching that game as I think I was 8 at the time, and it was a big deal, man.
So I think there were three phases to O.J. Simpson as we knew him and knew of him
Mm-hmm.
in the time that we were growing up and coming of age. And I think the second one would be his career as television pitchman, commentator, and actor.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Jim Brown mention is a little bit interesting there because Jim Brown went into acting after
Mm-hmm.
his football career was over, and O.J. Simpson went into acting after his football career was over. And dare I say, although I love Jimmy Brown in Dirty Dozen,
Mm-hmm.
dare I say that O.J. was more successful, and I'll get to where I say that in a moment.
Sure.
But he was a commentator on Monday Night Football on ABC very briefly.
Mm-hmm.
In that third chair that was supposed to be the color commentator between the play-by-play person Frank Gifford and Howard Cosell, who was supposed to be the third chair, but Howard, being just a force of personality, basically made the show about him.
Yeah,
And so
that's
Frank,
another podcast idea. Is a whole podcast on Howard Cosell. I mean,
oh, for
what a
God's
history!
sakes,
What a
yes.
character!
Yes. So it was really Howard's show. Frank was just there to call the actual game, and then the third person to do the color commentary was basically superfluous. Pardon me, and OJ was one of a quite a revolving door of people in that. So that was
Yeah,
a kind of a short and forgettable time. He kept wearing yellow though, because he also became a pitchman for Hertz Rent a Car. And I think we all recognize and remember those commercials, "Go OJ
a
Go,"
white-haired lady, baby.
as he takes his keys and then runs through the airport to get to the rental car station, because back in those days, folks, you did not have the cars within 100 feet as to where you actually rented your car.
Right.
No, your airline, where you dropped off your bags was in one part of the airport. Where you got your bags was another part of the airport. Where you went to pick up your rental car was a third part of the airport. And then in a totally separate part of the airport was where you got your rental car. So it was always important to go from where you picked up your rental car to your rental car as soon as possible, because then you are on your way and you are out of the damn airport. And so being able to go quickly, which is what Hertz was promoting, was a thing. And who was quicker at running through airports and jumping over bags than O.J. Simpson? Then OJ became an actor in his own right, or I should say, parallel to all this. He was in some of the disaster movies of the
Tower Inferno.
70s. I remember him being in a movie called Capricorn One
Yep. Yep.
about a staged first landing of astronauts on Mars, and he played the character Detective Norberg in the Naked Gun movies opposite Leslie Nielsen, where he played a good, clueless, stupid, dumb lug of a character.
Well, it's funny. Before there was Kenny on South Park, there was Norbert on in the Naked Gun movies, always having some bad thing happen to him. Like I remember, he was in a wheelchair after getting hurt, and they took him to the stadium, and he rolls down the row of stairs.
He
But yeah,
always was on crutches or had a sling on or had something around
yeah.
his head or he had always had some mishap.
But you're right. There was that. I mean, my first memory of him in a movie was not Capricorn One, but Towering Inferno. He was in
Mhm.
that one. But just to pull back a little bit and talk on an even bigger scale. So O.J. Simpson, as far as I can recall, was the first black athlete and really first black athlete, artist of any sort. Maybe you could talk about some of the Motown folks, but the first certainly black athlete who transcended not only his sport, but even his race. Because we talked about in our previous episode about alcohol, and I mentioned, some of the athletes and actors who did malt liquor commercials, Billy D. Williams, Fred the Hammer Williamson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, black actors or even athletes did stuff that was tailored to the black community. Like I said, malt liquor commercials, things of that nature. And then, the Wheaties box and the what you call quote unquote mainstream middle America stuff, that was always, white people of note. Bruce Jenner on the Wheaties box after the 76 Olympics. OJ was pitching Foster Grant glasses. He was pitching Hertz rental car. He was pitching, I think he even did a soda commercial. So, people talk about now how, Michael Jordan has transcended all those things with Gatorade, et cetera. Tiger Woods. I mean, we can name all kinds of different folks who have now, they're not, they're beyond just their sport or even their race. OJ really was the forerunner of all of that. He was the first black guy I remember seeing in commercials that you would normally not see black people in. And as the main pitch man, not kind of the side character. So, he was that big, not only as a TV commentator, as you mentioned, or as an actor, but as a pitch man. He was Jordan before there was a Jordan. He was the forerunner to all of those guys and women now who are pitching things that they just pitch stuff. There's no black people pitch black stuff, white people pitch. There's none of that now, but that's not how it used to be until OJ. He broke the barrier.
I think you bring up a fantastic point, and I am very appreciative of your perspectives as being African American and growing up, Gen X, and also, where you did. Um, I would say with O.J. Simpson was the first time I heard the term Q rating,
Mm.
you know, the advertising term about how popular somebody is. And I
Mhm.
would agree with you. I mean, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, there were not very many African American actors who had that
Mhm.
crossover appeal into white America.
Mhm.
And OJ was one of them. I would say Billy D to a much lesser extent. And then you had, your singers, Ray Charles, Diana Ross, Michael Jackson, until Michael just, took off in the mid 80s and became humongous. But I would say OJ was right up there, again, Muhammad Ali was very relevant because then by this time his active boxing career was over. I'll forget about like the 6 times he unretired to fight
Right.
tomato cans or get his ass kicked. But yeah, I mean, OJ was definitely on the medal stand of those folks who had crossover appeal.
Yeah, and you're right. There were other ones, but a lot of times it was either brands catered to black people or upstart brands. Like I remember Seven Up, because they wanted to be hip. They had. I remember there was a Sugar Ray Leonard one and a Magic Johnson one. But Hertz was I mean, in the 70s, that was the rental car place. I mean, that was like the gold standard. And so for OJ to be able to do that, that was a big deal. Foster Grant, that was one you would associate with upscale, high living, and to have this, football player pitching that brand. So he was pitching brands that were very mainstream, very much, up there. Ali, I think the most notable one he had was for Decon Roach Killer.
Oh my God, yes. Decon Roach Killer. And 7 Up also had what was his name? Jeffrey or Gregory Felder?
Oh,
The
Jeffrey
guy who played
Holder.
the tall zombie in Live and Let Die.
Jeffrey Holder. Greatest
Oh,
commercial ever. His
no
with the
caffeine. Never
never
had it. Never
never
will.
will.
7 Up.
Yeah. Oh, don't you feel good about 7 Up? Oh, greatest commercial or one of them ever. I
The
love those
laugh was
commercials.
awesome.
Oh, that was
That
beautiful.
laugh wasn't more of a thing.
But yeah, OJ was that dude. He really did blaze a bit of trail there as far as breaking that ceiling and those barriers as far as, and like you said, Q rating, because and I remember one time he very famously said, "I'm not black, I'm OJ." So before Tiger Woods rolled out, what was it, Cobble Asian or whatever the hell that was, he said when he first got
Tablet
big.
Asian.
Yeah, there was OJ saying, "I'm not black, I'm OJ," and that really was true. People, mainstream white America, looked at him as just OJ Simpson. It wasn't, oh, there's that black football dude. He was just OJ, and he
Well,
was.
go ahead.
And so yeah, that and people identified with him as just, he wasn't the black dude. He was OJ. And when you
Well,
said OJ, you knew who you were
and
talking
thus we go into the third act of this tragedy
about. Yeah.
because it was one of the most famous, not just black men, but men in America who then one, was accused of, people seem to think this all happened the same day.
Yeah.
The murder and the famous low speed chase in the white Ford Bronco. People seem to think that
Mhm.
happened the same day. It did not. It happened 3 days later. It happened on a Friday night, as
Right.
memory would serve, but it was on a Tuesday that OJ's then ex-wife, well, I guess she was, yeah, ex-wife,
That's why
and
Nicole
a
Brown.
guy who was a restaurant worker who came to bring her sunglasses that she had
Yep.
left at the restaurant, were killed and horribly slashed and murdered with a knife. And so OJ was brought in for questioning. He was released on his own recognizance. As I remember it, no charges had been filed at that time.
Mhm.
The DA in LA County was looking over evidence and,
Mhm.
was going to take it to a grand jury. But then, little next thing you know, Friday night, the special reports break in on the news, and if there was a special report on the news, it's not like the bullshit on the news networks now. It's a special report, and it's something that you've already heard 10
Yeah,
times already. Special report meant some serious shit was going down. And,
absolutely.
and there was what the beginning of what people call the first reality TV show, as you saw a fleet of LAPD cars at
Mhm.
about 40 miles an hour following a white Ford Bronco through the highways of LA.
Well, there were a couple of things about that whole situation, Bill, that you mentioned, and you're absolutely right. First of all, when Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman were murdered, nobody thought OJ. Um, there were all kinds of theories who had it in for OJ, who maybe didn't like the fact that he had gotten so big. I mean, there were, what was Nicole and Goldman into that made somebody want to kill? I mean, oh, nobody, the first thought, the second thought, the third thought, none of the thoughts were, damn, OJ killed his ex-wife and somebody who just had the misfortune of being in the same driveway as his ex-wife.
Everybody thought he was a nice man. They
Yeah,
thought
at
he
that
was
time he
Mr.
was
All
cool,
American. He was
right?
a
Because
hero.
You're right, because as things came out, he was not a nice man, and certainly how he treated Nicole Brown when they were married. There was a lot that came out later, but at the time, none of that had come out. Again, no internet to start pumping out, no TMZ to pump out the bad stuff that happened with celebrities or the bad things celebrities did. So nobody thought OJ could have done it. And then as the days went on, as you said, you started getting reports, they're starting to look here, they're starting to look here. OJ's coming in for questioning. So that was the first thing that I remember about that whole situation was it was days later before it sunk into to folks that OJ Simpson was involved in this thing in some way, shape, or form. And then obviously the car chase. And it's kind of one of those, do you remember where you were when this happened? And this was one of those events because if you remember, Bill, it was in June. The NBA finals were going on. I think it was Houston and the Knicks in 94. And the game was at Madison Square Garden. And I forget which game it was, but literally NBC had a split screen of the game. And I remember Bob Costas even had to talk about, look, there's this thing going on that we're going to follow. We're coordinating with NBC News if something breaks. But in the meantime, we're going to show you this in the corner. So you're watching, the NBA Finals, and in the little box in the corner, you're watching this slow speed chase. And it was kind of a surreal moment because, obviously there's this, major sporting event going on, but in the corner, you've got this drama playing out. And like you said, it really was the first, in my mind, reality TV type of event, one that captured the country. And then obviously you get into the trial and literally, during the day there was no daytime TV. There was the court case. I mean, they showed every minute of it because they decided to broadcast the case live. The judge Ito decided to do that, and yeah, it was showed live to the world. So that
Yeah.
that was crazy.
So we only have a few minutes left, but for me, I remember that night. Yeah, it was a Friday night. It was ABC because we were ABC people at the time. So Peter Jennings and who had Al Michaels call in. So Peter Jennings was doing the live play-by-play, and then I remember when OJ's car, driven by the famous Al Cowlings,
AC
AC,
baby.
went back to OJ's house. There were calls coming in. I remember a very wicked, funny but morbidly so, and probably today and probably then even. Why the hell did that even happen? Prank phone call from a follower of Howard Stern's radio show
Oh dear God.
talking about being able to see OJ and that he's somebody, some bystander sitting behind a news van and he sees OJ and all sorts of things. And then at the end of the call, he says, and Baba Booey to you all, and then hangs up the phone
Oh my
and Peter
God.
Jennings goes on. And then Al Michaels, who had been on Howard Stern's show a lot, said, Peter, this is Al Michaels. That was a totally farcical call. The caller said something in code that was indicative of mentioning the name of a certain radio show, talk show host. So, lest you think that that was anybody who was actually on the scene, let me assure you that it is not.
Right.
And Peter Jennings was like, Peter Jennings was all fucking cool. He's like, well, Al, thank you. We have them on every coast, I believe. And so that was it. They moved on. But it was ridiculousness. But
It
it
was.
got over the ensuing many months,
Yeah.
very serious. Obviously, a lot of facts came out about who this man was.
Yep.
And it shattered an image. Two lives were destroyed. Of course, we know what the outcome was of the criminal trial. We know what happened subsequently. We know what happened subsequent in O.J. Simpson's life. And I don't think we necessarily need to go there. But and the outcome of that criminal trial, I think it meant a certain, you know, um, an era in the age of celebrity had passed,
Yeah,
because we certainly saw the the muddy feet, as it were,
yeah.
you certainly run a risk to put your heroes on a pedestal.
And I think that was definitely the
Made
start,
of
like you said,
clay are the terms is the term I'm
beautiful.
thinking.
'Cause you're right, there was a level even into the '80s, although it started breaking in the '80s, we could talk about, Gary Hart and Jim Baker and some other ones, but, up until the '80s, certainly through our youth, there was a level of almost protection for people of power, of celebrity, of fame, and I think OJ's case tore the veneer completely off. Like I said, there were little touches of it, but it was stuff like Gary Hart and Jim Baker that was so obvious you couldn't not see it. That doesn't exist anymore. And I think, like you said, OJ, the image of everything up until 1994 was totally ripped away. You got a picture of a man that was fundamentally flawed behind the smile and the athletic prowess. And like you said, it definitely introduced reality TV, starting with the car chase where you had people literally stopping what they were doing and going to overpasses to wave at the Bronco. Um, so the whole idea of not just reporting on the news or viewing the news, but making yourself a part of the news. I think that train started with the 1994 murders and subsequent trial, and all the people from the trial that we got to know who became famous of their own rights. And now on TV, I was watching TV this morning, and I mean, look at all the attorneys now who are famous just for reporting on Trump or other stuff. I mean, attorneys are now celebrities, but the first attorneys that really were celebrities probably were the ones involved in the OJ Simpson case. So that was another element of, you know, who thought of, besides fictional TV characters, famous lawyers? Well, no, now they're famous real life lawyers, and that started, I think, with OJ.
Right. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
it's a lot there.
The definition of who could become a celebrity changed.
Yes, at that bingo, because obviously from the OJ case, we have one of his attorneys, a gentleman by the name of Robert Kardashian, who had a daughter who did a sex tape, who then led her family into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that we know today. So another part of the OJ effect, without OJ, do we get the Kardashians? Probably not. But we did because of the celebrity element that came out of this trial of the century. So that's another sidebar.
Right.
Not to be legal, but that's another sidebar.
Yeah. So we're at time, but I will say that this podcast started out with its typical flair, and then, at least for me, ended up on a bit of a somber note, and that's okay. That's exactly where I wanted to lay it, because where it left the world was indelibly changed. That's where he left the world.
Yeah, I think if
The
I
world
think
of
this adds.
popular culture is different because he was there and
Yeah,
because of what he did.
yeah. Well, you can't, like you said, it ended on a somber note, but the story did of this man and his life and career arc and life arc. So there really is no other way to end it based
Exactly.
on based on where things landed in 1994 and subsequent years. So it is if you want to talk about fall from grace, I don't know if there are many further falls than one Orenthal James Simpson.
No,
Um,
no, sir.
yeah,
All right, Steve. Well, with that, we wrap up another edition of But Before We Go, but join us next week for our rip roaring 10th episode. Yes, 10 episodes already, where we talk about shit that our ancestors told us that wasn't true. Until then, for Steve, I'm Bill. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.